Hello, and welcome to the second edition of the Pennsylvania School Counselors Association Ramp Camp. Today, we will be talking to you about Section 5 of the Ramp application, which is the Advisory Council, which is worth 6 points. After today's session, we hope that you will be able to understand the purpose and critical elements of a successful advisory council, and we hope that you feel prepared to organize an advisory council and advisory council meeting components. There are two of us presenting to you today. My name is Leslie Delvecchio Marks. I am an elementary school counselor at a school located in suburban Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it's a K-3 school. I am also a member of the Pennsylvania School Counselors Association, and I am currently on the board of directors. I was also named the 2020-2021 Pennsylvania School Counselor of the Year, which is still a great honor in my life. I am also considered an ASCA certified school counselor. So I received that designation when my school applied for RAMP in 2022. And I am fortunate that our school was named a RAMP School of Distinction that year as well, which was exciting as a first RAMP application. So this is exciting that I'm a part of this RAMP camp. And now I'm also a RAMP reviewer. So I'm hoping that my experience going through the process as someone who was submitting a RAMP application and now somebody who's on the other end reviewing RAMP applications will help you out today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Zaharakis, and I am an elementary school counselor in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's an urban public school, has a lot of needs. So I do want to say as we start this advisory council presentation and training that this section was the one I was most anxious about when I thought about applying for RAMP. But it was also the most rewarding part of the RAMP application, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. I'm also a member of the Pennsylvania School Counselors Association. I've been on the board of directors in the past, and this past year I was chair of the scholarship committee. Another really great area of professional development for me was getting involved with our local Lehigh Carbon School Counselor Association. On the executive committee now, have held some offices in the past. I am also the co-creator and a development consultant for SCUDA, which is a company that my husband had started to help school counselors. Learned a lot about the whole national model and working towards a comprehensive program through that development. And in 2020, I received RAMP designation for my school. And last year was the first year that I was a RAMP reviewer, which was also a great opportunity to learn from. And also we want to recognize Dr. Fuller. She's my colleague in Allentown. Now she is a school counselor in Emmaus, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb. She had earned RAMP. She was the first person I knew personally who earned RAMP distinction for her school, and that was when she was in Allentown. But she is an adjunct professor at Lehigh University working with the school counseling students. She also is involved with the Lehigh Carbon School Counselor Association with me as a past president. And Sue is really a leader for me, a role model for me. And I was very impressed and still am about how much she puts into the world of school counseling through her blog and her Twitter, Facebook, and Pinterest handles there you can see on the screen. So what is an advisory council? The advisory council is a representative group of stakeholders who review and advise the school counselors and the whole team there to enhance implementation of a comprehensive school counseling program. Advisory council members have the potential to act as supporters, advocates, problem solvers, collaborators. They can help you build community partnerships and get some additional resources for your school program. Council membership should include people who mirror the demographics of your school population. That is really a key feature that adds integrity to the council. It's important to be intentional about who you're inviting and include in your application why you're inviting certain people. Again, is to make sure that all voices in your school are heard and have input into your program.
So what are some advisory council tasks? Well, the advisory council members are big advocates for the school counseling program. And that's something you say to them right from the very beginning when they accept their role on your council. Also, they really are important in advising on your program goals. So we will talk about this, but when you present your goals, you really want to seek feedback and suggestions from your advisory council members on those goals. Also, they help you to explore and discuss your program results. So as we will talk about later, we start by presenting our goals to our advisory council. And then in our second meeting of the year, we talk about the results of those goals. And the advisory council members are really instrumental in discussing those results and providing feedback as well on those. And your advisory council members should make recommendations and suggestions regarding the school counseling program. That's why, as Laura mentioned, you want to be intentional about who you pick to be on your advisory council, because you really want to have some members who aren't afraid to make some critiques if needed and suggestions regarding that school counseling program. And these members really enhance community partnerships. And when you choose these members, you want to try to strategically pick some members of the community. Sometimes it's nice if you have access to some business owners or some people in your community that have access to a wide array of different services that could benefit your school and your students. And the advisory council members provide suggestions and reflective evaluation regarding the program impact and may reveal those areas of need in your school community as well, and get you thinking beyond your school and how the community's needs could benefit your direct school.
For our presentation, we included a slide called Your Ramp Advisory Council is Not. The reason we did that is because we're in Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, our school districts also have K-12 guidance plan advisory councils. Your advisory council that you establish for your individual school is very different from your K-12 guidance plan advisory council. The purpose of Chapter 339 is to underscore the importance of PA career and work standards instruction. So that council is going to support district-wide initiatives in all grades around that work. So it's very important that your advisory council for your school and the one you're going to talk about in your RAMP application is very different. Now, there may be some overlap of members, but your RAMP council is focused solely on your individual school's comprehensive program and addresses the needs of your students and school community specifically. So here's a slide with a little more distinction between the two advisory councils. I want to make it clear that your ASCA National Model Advisory Council focuses on school-specific comprehensive school counseling program. It is not a subset of another advisory group or committee. School counselors will take the lead in creating the council, planning the agenda, and sharing information. For your National Model Advisory Council, all domains of the program, academic, social, emotional, and career, are reviewed with stakeholders. That's one of the big distinctions with the K-12 guidance plan. Although those other areas might be mentioned, when you meet with your council, the focus is usually mainly on career development. For your National Model Advisory Council, program goals, intervention plans, progress data, and outcomes are shared with members for feedback. And again, we're going to say this again, Leslie and I might say this a couple times, representation should match the school community's makeup, meaning it should be reflective of the demographics and all voices within your school. You're going to have access to this presentation. So I did hyperlink there the K-12 guidance plan information from our PD website. But it is, like I said before, it is a little bit different. The focus is different. You want to make sure in your advisory council meetings, you're talking about all those different domains, academic, social, emotional, and career, and really talk about specific issues within your school community.
And we want to mention that we also called this advisory council for your district the Chapter 339 Advisory Council, but it is now called the K-12 Guidance Plan. But we kept in that Chapter 339 term because we know a lot of counselors still refer to it as that, but the new name is the K-12 Guidance Plan, but it's basically the same thing. So when thinking about your own school's advisory council, not that K-12 Guidance Plan Advisory Council, ASCA recommends 2 meetings in the application timeline. And actually, in this presentation, that application timeline is linked. And I want to just click on this so you can see what that looks like, because it really is a nice tool that's developed by ASCA, where if you're planning on setting up certain things in your RAMP application, it gives you a nice timeline of when you should be looking at things. So, for example, if we're looking specifically at the advisory council, of course, you would want to have established your advisory council before this, because you should set up an advisory council for your comprehensive school counseling program, not for the purpose of applying for RAMP. So you would already have had your advisory council planned out. You have your team members. You've had a couple meetings already, but in your data collection year, in August and September of that year, you want to already start planning, if you haven't already, because a lot of times in our spring meeting, we set up our fall meeting date. But if you haven't already, you want to start looking at those advisory council meeting dates and agendas and start working on them already in September or August. So that's something to keep in mind. And also in April and May, because usually that spring meeting is usually, it's towards the end of the year. So that looks like April or May specifically for most of us. But you want to already start looking at that spring semester meeting and working on agendas and slide presentations and things like that. So that is something you can look more in depth when you have access to this slide presentation. But just so you're aware, the timing of October and March is a guideline. A lot of times that may not be best for your program. Ideally, that's great, but I know personally for myself, my meetings are usually in December and May. It just has to work with you and what's best for your program. But you have to make sure that it at least occurs once during the fall semester and once during the spring semester. The agenda and goals for each meeting will vary according to how long the advisory council has been in place and the current needs of your school. So there's a little guidelines, there's a checklist we have on the side. You need to make sure that your membership includes an administrator. And as Laura mentioned already, and we're going to keep mentioning it, representatives of the school and community, a diverse group that's inclusive of all members of your community. It should meet at least twice a year, and the meeting should maintain an agenda and minutes. We'll talk about that too. It advises on school counseling mission, vision, and annual student outcome goals and makes recommendations. The advisory council meeting makes sure that meetings advocate and engage in public relations for the school counseling program. Having advisory council meetings is a great public relations tool, as you will learn. And it advocates for school counseling program funding and resources too, because a lot of the things that you talk about with your advisory council just sparks conversation on how certain programs can evolve from what you're already doing and what needs you may need. And sometimes that does involve some funding and resources, requiring money or not, but it's just a really great way to get that knowledge to other people in your school community and your school. And it's really a nice advocacy tool.
So your advisory council requirements include that the council must meet at least once in the fall and once in the spring. I will add in that at my school, we try to meet 3 times a year. We try to do an early fall, a mid-year around February meeting, and then one at the end of the spring semester, because my members had expressed feedback that they would like to meet again at the end of the school year so they can see the final outcome data and how our intervention supports really turned out in terms of how the kids were changed because of them. Your advisory council must include 8 to 20 members. You must have an agenda. You must keep meeting minutes and use handouts and presentations. So we're going to talk about this again later, but your agenda and your meeting minutes must follow the ASCA template. To use that template for that. That was a new thing. When I prepared my application back in 2019-20 school year, that wasn't a requirement. So I'm very sensitive to that. You have to make sure that you're always looking at the current rubric for anything you do with RAMP applications. And use of handouts and presentations, of course, that's going to vary school to school. We're going to give you some examples later on in the presentation, but you really want to make this a vibrant, interactive, helpful counsel. So provide them anything you think will give them a picture of your school community, your school needs, what intervention supports your school is providing the students. Really make it as robust and engaging as you can.
Now we are going to take a closer look at the scoring rubric for this section, which for the Advisory Council is section 5 of the RAMP application and is worth 6 points. So on this side of the screen is the snapshot of that rubric. We are using the 2023 rubric, and that can be found on the schoolcounselor.org, which is the ASCA website. If you are on the ASCA website, you want to look under recognition, the tab recognition, and then go all the way up to RAMP, which is the recognized ASCA model program. And when you click that, you will see what's on the screen right here. The scoring rubric that we're using today is the 2023. And like I said, we just kind of snipped that for you so you could see it on the slide presentation. But just know for the purpose of this presentation, we are using that rubric, but sometimes it does get updated. So just make sure to reference that website when it does come time to submit your application in case there are any changes. So for the purpose of this presentation, we wanted to point out a couple things to you on this rubric in case you haven't seen it. Each section of the scoring rubric is divided into certain components that are needed for that particular section of the RAMP application. For the Advisory Council, there are 6 sections, A through F, and each component underneath the section title is listed. They're actually called descriptors, I'm sorry. And the descriptors lay out specifically what is needed in that particular section to earn the point for that section. So you want to make sure that you are looking very closely at this rubric when you are completing the portal for this application. So for section 5A, this talks specifically about Advisory Council membership. And I do want to mention that for this section, you do want to upload these 2 components, the first semester and second semester Advisory Council agenda templates and the first and second semester Advisory Council minute templates. And they are different because they are different for the fall and spring. So just keep that in mind. But for the membership, you want to, and we've said this several times, you want to make sure that when you choose or when you are delivering an Advisory Council meetings and the whole component of your comprehensive school counseling program, that you do want to really make sure that you set up an Advisory Council at least the year before you decide to apply for RAMP, because we do not, as RAMP reviewers, and ASCA does not want to see that an Advisory Council was just set up the year that you're applying for RAMP, because that should have been established beforehand, because the Advisory Council advises on the comprehensive school counseling program in general. And remember, the RAMP application is just a snapshot. It's proof that you do follow a comprehensive school counseling program for your school. So the Advisory Council is just a piece of that, and the RAMP application is just a snapshot of the comprehensive school counseling program. So just want to stress again that Advisory Council should be in effect before you even decide to apply for RAMP. But you want to make sure that, so if there it is, section A1, 5A1 says that it's focused on the school counseling program. Also, you want to list the Advisory Council members and their positions. So when you fill out that part of the RAMP application, you are listing the name of that person and their title. So it could be Jesse James, the first grade teacher. Also, the membership represents and includes minimally parents, teachers, school counselors, administrators, and business and community members, and students if appropriate. When you're in an elementary school, you may not have students on your Advisory Council, and that's fine. And you want to make sure that you stick to this membership requirements. So at least 8 and no more than 20. That gives you, if you meet all of these requirements, you get 1 point. For the agendas, it's very specific, and we'll talk about this more as we go along, but one component or one descriptor is that you need to use the template, and it's really nice and user-friendly, by the way. Those templates are great. And then also you want to make sure in your first semester that you include at minimum a school data summary, the annual student outcome goal plans, and the classroom and group mindsets and behaviors action plan, as well as your closing the gap action plan. So these are all included in your first semester agenda. And the second semester, we talked about how at first you talk about what your goals will be and the plans for those. Second semester, you're talking about the results. So in that second semester, you're talking about the annual student outcome goal plan results, your classroom group results report, your classroom, and that's for the classroom. You also talk about a small group, the results report from that small group, and you're closing the gap action plan and results report. And then the same for the minutes. First semester kind of outlines what those goals will be, and then somebody at your meeting should be taking minutes for you. So that you need to make sure you use the template again. You need to make sure that your minutes match that agenda. So when you create your minutes template, you pull right from the order of your agenda. So if you start with introductions for your agenda, your minute starts with introductions. If your second part of your agenda says annual student outcome goals, then your second part of your minutes talks about those annual student outcome goals. So everything should match each other. Same thing for your second semester advisory council minutes, and this is all laid out for you. And then for your reflection, and I want to stress that your reflection should, if it says it's 250 words maximum, it needs to be 250 words maximum. So you want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're typing in the portal, your reflection. And the first part, you need to provide the rationale for membership selection. And it needs to include why it's inclusive of all voices in your school community. So you need to get specific about that when you talk about that particular reflection question. And then for the second reflection question, it says to reflect on the following, which is, and you need to give 2 or more examples of how the advisory council strengthens and improves the school counseling program. So a nice way to phrase that when you're talking about that is you actually say the first example of how the school counseling advisory council strengthens the programming in my school is this, and the second example is this, and that makes it nice and easy for the reviewers to see your exact examples. And just again, make sure that you use a maximum of 250 words. So we will talk more about these descriptors and these components as we move through this slide presentation, but I at least wanted to go over some of that rubric with you for that.
Okay, we're going to move on to just summarize some ramp tips that are right there on the rubric. So Leslie already touched upon this. Make sure that you use the ASCA templates, which are hyperlinked there. It goes right to, and you can always download those as a zip file from the ASCA website. Include students if that's appropriate. If you are at a secondary school, it may be very helpful to have some student voice. Actually, I'm not even going to say helpful. I think it's great. I think that you should include some students if you're at a secondary level to have feedback. Make sure you add as an agenda item feedback from the group. That's really important, so you don't forget to include that. And make sure your minutes align with the agenda. That's where I'm going to say here, Leslie had already mentioned, to make sure you have somebody taking notes so that you can write up a really nice, comprehensive, detailed minutes of your meeting. Make sure that you have that feedback. Name who gave you what specific feedback. That's something that's very important because that illustrates how the advisory council is giving you what is doing their job and giving you the feedback about your program. Don't forget to upload all the supporting materials and make sure, again, we're going to say it, include a summary of all feedback discussions in the minutes. If there was no feedback, specifically write that. There is no feedback from members on this agenda item, but don't have that a lot. That would not be good because their purpose is to give you feedback. So make sure you include all of that. Now, establishing your advisory council. I had mentioned before in my introduction that This was the part of preparing to implement a national model program in my school that I was most anxious about. I had never opened myself up, and I have another counselor with me, so both of us had never opened ourselves up for some constructive criticism, feedback, suggestion. So this was very emotionally difficult for us to do, but it was also the most emotionally rewarding part of establishing a comprehensive program. So you want to make sure that the purpose of your advisory council, and that everybody understands this, is that you want to strengthen and improve your program. It doesn't matter if you're applying for RAMP or not. You know what I mean? This is a really critical part of implementing a national model. Acknowledge your own feelings about it. Like I just said, we were really anxious about it. And I'm a big fan of just saying what you feel in front of people. So even when you have that meeting, or, just acknowledge that this is a difficult thing to do, but that you need people's feedback. You want that. You want to make sure it's a safe place for people to give suggestions. The way that I started deciding who was going to be a part of my advisory council, who I was going to invite to be a part of it, is the previous year I had done an end of the year needs assessment. And one of the questions I should clarify, I did the needs assessment with the faculty and staff at my school. One of the questions was, would you be willing to be on a committee to give feedback and support the school counseling program initiatives? So anybody that answered yes got an invitation. Again, we said this before about identifying stakeholders and potential advisory council members. You want to include a variety of school staff members, not just instructional staff. You may want some paraprofessionals to be part of that advisory council. If it's appropriate, you may want a student. Definitely at least one of your school leaders. If you have a principal and assistant principal, at least one of them should be there. Parents and students, don't just reach out to parents who are already very involved in the school. Look for maybe those parents that have a voice, but it might be a quiet voice. Give them an opportunity to share. You don't want just the people who are very outgoing and already a part of your school community to be included. Reach out to your central office administrators, I should say. If you're in a small school district, you might see your superintendent, assistant superintendents a lot more. I'm in a larger school district. We don't see those people as much, but we did invite them, and we did have some central office administrators be a part of our team. School board members. I specifically invited 3 school board members who had been to events at my school. I thought that was a comfortable approach for them. I know some people that just send an invitation to every single school board member and see who wants to be involved. So either approach is good. It depends on the nature of your school. I did not have a local legislator, but Dr. Fuller did, and that was key. It was awesome to have input from your local state Congress people. Local higher education folks, local community agencies. For example, I invited people from an after-school program that many of my students attended. People who knew the children and knew the needs of the community were also invited. And also key neighborhood people. If there's people who are involved in your school, maybe they're donating Italian ice for field day. Maybe they are always seeing your kids, because they always go to the corner store to get pizza and sodas after school. Anybody who has interaction with your school community could be invited. And finally, make sure you send an invitation to participate. You could send 2. You could send an invitation inviting them to be a part of the council, or you can combine it into one invitation.
And one thing I wanted to add too is, just like it said in the rubric, make sure that one of those potential members is another school counselor, especially if you're the lone school counselor in your building. Maybe ask another person in your building, or if you have a parent that happens to be a school counselor, that's a double bonus, but make sure there is another school counselor invited as well.
And also, Leslie, you jogged my memory. We also invited people that serve district-wide initiatives. Like I invited our homeschool visitor whose, what do I say, catchment wasn't just our school, but she worked with families around attendance. So she served many different schools, and she was a part of our community. School social workers, Don't forget about those people who support your school. If you have any contracts with community agencies that provide school-based therapy or counseling, they would be great assets as well, because they get to know the kids in a different way and help give feedback and input about what your kids need in terms of services at tier 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so an early timeline. Just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how the process of establishing and facilitating an advisory council works. For the date and time, remember, you're going to need at least 2 meetings. Think about when you're going to collect data to include to help you describe to your stakeholders that are part of your council your student needs. Think about what day of the week, time of day, virtual or in person, what format works best for your stakeholders. Think about your space. Definitely have a space in your school that highlights like the culture, the climate of your school. We always meet in our library because that always seems to be such a cozy space for us. Make sure you note that on your invitation of where they are going to be meeting. You can invite members to RSVP via email. Consider a graphic invite. We're going to give you a really cool example that Dr. Fuller had done for hers. Make sure that you confirm responsive of attendees and reach out to the people that did not respond to you to make sure that you didn't miss it. You want to make sure you plan for everyone. For example, I think it's great to always have refreshments. You want to make sure that you have enough for everyone. You're going to probably prepare some materials. You want to make sure that you have enough for everyone. And again, send a meeting reminder a few days before. Be prepared and plan for changes of attendees. That's okay. You want to make sure that you invite enough people. So you're always going to have some people that aren't going to be able to make it. Make sure that you invite enough people to be part of your council that if, let's say, 25% of them aren't there, that you still have a robust group of voices discussing your needs. Okay, so getting ready for the meeting. You want to make sure that you have a complete ASCA modeled agenda. You're going to get 1 point in your rubric for the fall one and 1 point for the spring. Make sure you use the template. You also want to make sure that you have handouts for all the attendees. And also, it's a great idea if people could not attend your advisory council, make sure that they have access to everything that you do in the meeting, because you want them to feel included and be able to give you ongoing feedback and suggestions for your next meeting. I think it's always nice to give some hard copies, but you may also want to email your group an agenda, some of the background documents or presentation materials that you may be using. Refreshments are always good. Make sure that you have for your presentation that it is something that's understandable to the wide variety of people that are going to be in your group. You don't want to make it so, what do I want to say, like textbook heavy or difficult to understand. Not everybody who's going to be in your group is an educator. Sometimes we use a lot of lingo and acronyms. Make sure that you spell all of that out so people understand what you're talking about. Some people in your council may have not been in a school for 10, 20 years. So you need to remind them about some of these things and also just provide things within a language that everybody can understand. Make sure that you practice and try to use some participation tools to involve everybody. You can even like have some interactive groups talking about things and then speaking out, just like you would with a classroom. Be mindful of the seating arrangement. Make sure that not everybody is faced the same way towards you as the speaker. A semicircle, I had mentioned before, we meet in our library, so there's little tables, so people kind of spread around at the tables. Make sure it's like a warm and cozy atmosphere to make sure everybody feels comfortable. And again, for the minutes, just like the agenda, make sure you use the template, and you're going to get a point on the rubric for each of the fall and the spring minutes.
So now we are going to focus more in depth on the agenda for your meetings. And as we had talked about, there is a fall and spring agenda that needs to be submitted as a part of the RAMP application. And they're similar, except that the fall agenda really focuses on your goals for the year and your plan to meet those goals. And your spring agenda talks about the results of those goals. So you want to start off your fall and spring agenda with introductions. And then you go right into, in the fall, the school data summary. It's a nice place to start because that is really that's really the beginning of where you get your goals. So you usually complete your school data summary with your annual student outcome goal. And that school data summary is just the summary of the needs that your school had the year before, or from your data from the year before. And like those gaps, they come up in that school data summary. You take a really close look at attendance and achievement and discipline. And then from that school data summary, you explain how you got your annual student outcome goals or goal. In the past, ASCA recommended that school counselors come up with 2 to 3 goals, but now they're actually suggesting 1 to 2, but primarily 1. If you can really get 1 annual student outcome goal that you're focused on, that's great. You don't need to have 2 necessarily. You could, but you don't need to. And then you go through that whole classroom and group mindsets and behavior action plan in the fall meeting. And then you talk more specifically about your closing the gap action plan. And remember, your closing the gap action plan, if you have 1 annual student outcome goal, your closing the gap goal could be that 1 annual student outcome goal. It's the same thing. Or it could be one of your annual student outcome goals. And then you always allow time for feedback and discussion, even in that agenda. So you make sure that's a bullet point, feedback and discussion, although you have feedback and discussion really in every section of that agenda.
I just wanted to add in there that, a lot of times during this presentation, we're talking about specifically how to earn full points on the rubric. But there's a couple little things when we thought about putting our advisory council together, like hopefully this is going to be a long-term group, right? That's going to get together regularly. Sometimes you might have some members join, some members might leave. But I think that also at the end of the day, you want to make sure that it's a successful group in terms of, like I said, having a safe space so people do feel comfortable sharing their feedback and insights with you. One thing that I did to help establish that climate and culture within the group was, as I was introducing people, I did share with them a little bit of what you do want to include in your ramp application, which is why certain people were invited to participate. I just felt that was good, so people knew why the other people were there. They might not even know some of the people. So I thought that was a nice way. And also, in terms of agenda, like, again, this is not part of the template, but you can also integrate some kind of getting to know you, but some comfortable way that there's a little bit of more of an informality so people can get to know each other and build some relationships among themselves as well.
Yes, that's great. And that also made me remember in my very first advisory council meeting, because remember, you want to have these before you start getting into the ramp application. But that very first one, you do a lot of what Laura just said. You make sure you're introducing everybody. You explain why they were chosen to be on the council. My little introduction activity was to have each member share their memories of their guidance counselor and what their guidance counselor did. And that led into a whole talk about the difference between school counselors and guidance counselors. So it kind of allows you to open up about the motto and explain all that too. So you do really want it to be a nice, welcoming environment. And that was really a nice activity for my advisory council, because some people said similar things like, I don't even remember my guidance counselor I heard a lot about, or I just really remember them at the secondary level and they were helping me schedule classes. So it's a nice way to just kind of introduce the difference between guidance counseling of the past and school counseling currently. So thank you, Laura, for that. Mm-hmm. And just like we said, the agenda for the spring is very, very similar. So in the fall, you talk about your annual student outcome goal or goals and the plan to achieve those goals. And then you talk about the results of those goals in the spring. You talked about your plan for your classroom and a group and how your standards were aligned with those. And in the spring, you take a snapshot of one of those classroom lessons and you talk about the results of that. And then you take a snapshot of one of your small groups and you talk about the results of that. So these don't have to necessarily be aligned with your annual student outcome goal, but it's nice if they are. So if your annual student outcome goal focused on attendance, for example, and one of your classroom lessons was about attendance, that's great. That's a nice tie-in. But it really the key is that you want to talk about a specific classroom lessons and the results of that lesson, including graphs, and we'll talk about this moving forward. And the same thing with a small group. You pick a small group, one small group, and you talk about the results of that small group, including graphs and all of that again. And then you talk more specifically about that closing the gap plan. Now, sometimes, like I said, that closing the gap goal is one of your annual student outcome goals. And this is often is the case for my meetings. So that's sort of a 2-in-1 agenda item. So I'll talk about what that annual student outcome goal was, and then I'll just re-explain that particular annual student outcome goal was the closing the gap goal. And these are the results of that too. So you get specific about that, and then you allow feedback and discussion. But just keep in mind, as Laura said, in these meetings, this is the minimum of what you should have on your agenda, but you can include other things too, as you'll see in some of our samples later, that just make it a little bit more engaging and lively. For the minutes, very similar. It's just a more in-depth explanation of the agenda and what actually happened in the meeting. So you really wanted to, when you have a note taker picked, somebody who's going to keep your minutes, it's always nice to kind of set up everything in advance in the template for them. So they're just really adding some feedback. And like Laura mentioned earlier in the presentation, you really want to include what the members said. So member Jones asked a specific question about the school data summary. Like, you want to put that in there and summarize that feedback, but try to include as much feedback as possible, like we had mentioned. Make sure that your agenda items match the outline for the minutes. So whatever you start with on the agenda is what starts on the minutes, and you kind of move through that way. So, and like we said, you want to include the summaries of all of these things that we mentioned that are on the agenda. So you include at minimum all of these things in the fall, and the same thing in the spring. It's matching that outline for the agenda. And you include the summaries of all these agenda items in the same order. So everything should be in the same order. Your presentation, your agenda, your minutes, everything is all in the same order. It's all consistent. So make sure that you're just comparing that. But as you do this as a part of your comprehensive school counseling program, this is something that's second nature. You're just used to doing that because you use your agenda to set up your slide presentation, etc. So just make sure that there's those two sections that are split up from the classroom and group results report. You have the classroom. It doesn't have to be in this particular order. You can do small group first, by the way, but you want to make sure you give the specifics about your classroom results report and the small group. And then, like we said, just any other items on your agenda that may not be listed here. But that's a good snapshot of what you're looking at as a comparison. So here are some sample documents that we wanted to share with you. We know that it's helpful to see things. We are going to show you some of these things right now, but just know that we have the links for the other parts of this too, so that you can look at it more in depth when you have access to the slide presentations.
Okay, so Leslie, would you click on the Muhlenberg invitation?
Sure.
This is one that Dr. Fuller had made, and she is very creative. Where do you see this? It's definitely engaging, attractive, right? Catches your attention. She describes the purpose of the advisory council. She gives a little outline of the agenda. Your agenda when you're at the actual meeting will probably be more detailed. It's like a party invitation, which I think sets a really awesome tone for the advisory council. So you could do something really creative like that, or Leslie's going to pull up my invitation, which looks totally different.
But still effective.
This is an example of reaching out to my school board members. And I had mentioned before, I invited school board members that had been at functions in my school. I thought that was because we have quite a big board of directors. But really just explaining what RAMP stands for, what we're looking for from them, outlining the expectations of the advisory council. So just really giving a lot of background, because this was the year before. What happened for me personally is I switched schools. I was planning to do apply for ramp earlier. And then the year that would have been my data year, I transferred schools. So I was reaching out to invite some new people to be a part of my advisory council. Actually, some of the members stayed the same because I was looking at stakeholders within our district. But I needed to explain why I was asking people to participate, and just word it in a really nice way so they understand what this is all about. So it could be something really fun, like a party invitation, like Dr. Fuller's, or it could be a letter like mine.
And
Thank you, Leslie.
they're both effective and very nice. They get the point across in a nice way. We just talked about the agenda and minutes, and I'm going to give you a sample first of the agenda that I actually used for my most recent advisory council meeting, which was in May of 2023. And this is just from the agenda. Now, what I usually do is I pull these agendas into Google, and it's just easier for me to access them. So I just uploaded the templates into my Google Drive for every section. And that's what I use to create my agendas, because, in Google, you can make a copy of this. So a lot of these top things stay the same. So your school counseling vision statement comes first. You put the name of your school and the time and date of your meeting. And then the mission statement comes next. And all of this other stuff can kind of stay the same. That's why I put it into Google. But your goals will change, but the sections sort of, for the most part, can stay the same. So I changed my goal, but they're both, from year to year. But for this year, goal number 1 is listed and goal number 2. And then the agenda items are listed, and they are in the order, or at least include what is on the rubric. So that welcome and introduction is included, and you always want to put the school counselor facilitating the discussion on this side. Now, I am the lone counselor in my building, but if you have multiple counselors, you would list out those counselors depending on which agenda item they will be facilitating the discussion for. So this name could change if you have multiple counselors, obviously, in your building. So you list out those agenda items, and then you actually put the date of your next advisory council there as well. Now, what is helpful is and I'm sure Laura does this too, please feel free to mention this, but when I send out my invitation for that meeting, at least 2 weeks in advance, I include the agenda. And the nice thing about Google is if you decide to change something, that changes live. So let's say, like, for example, I sent mine out and then I thought, oh, you know what, I'm going to make sure that my Closing the Gap is included with my annual student outcome goal report. So, and I changed the order of it. So initially when I sent out the email, I had Closing the Gap later, but then I moved it up because it is one of my annual student outcome goals. So you can always change that, in real time when you use Google. So that's an example of a second semester agenda. First semester would be similar. And then I also wanted to just reference this. This actually, I included the 2020 Fall Birchfield primary minutes. These particular minutes, the template looks a little bit different, like it's like light red and it's more descriptive now, but I wanted to include this so you could look at it, because these minutes were featured on the ASCA website as an example of an exemplary minute submission. So I included this so you can look at it on your own just to see how specific it is. Even though the template looks a little bit different now, at least look at the specifics on those minutes. Please look at these we have Dr. Fuller and Laura's examples from their meetings, fall and spring. But I wanted to at least open up the most recent slide presentation for that spring meeting that I just showed you the agenda for. So we can look through this more closely, but I always in fall and spring talk about what an advisory council is and what they do. And we basically talked about this in our presentation. And when we do the welcome, I always have this presented on the screen. So the members that are present will go around and say who their names are and their role on the advisory council. And it's always, like I said, up on the screen, because I have a lot of people on my advisory council, and sometimes you forget specifically what each member does. Then you go through the agenda, which aligns with your agenda that you already sent out. This is just in the presentation form. And then as it says here, after our welcome, it goes right into the goals. So you explain your goal. And like I said, that Closing the Gap action plan, I explained what that is because it was related to that. And you just go into more specifics. So this is just an example of what your slide presentation could look like. This presentation was, this particular slide was also shared in the beginning of the year because it talks specifically about that particular goal and the demographics of the students involved in that and the interventions. And then the most important part of the spring is you get into the results of the goal. And I just wanted to show you that I had 2 goals, and one of the goals was effective, as you can see by the smiley Leslie emoji. You kind of talk about that. You allow time for discussion. But my second goal was not met. So I wanted to show you that. There you go. Whoopsies. So we had an achievement goal with our Dibble score, and we had a new initiative in our building, and it was not met, and that's okay. And then you talk about why that's okay and the plans for the next year. And when you're really candid like that, I think the members of your advisory council appreciate that. They all gave really positive feedback about well, now there's good places to start, and it's really sparked some nice conversations. So don't be frustrated if you don't exactly meet your goal. I just wanted to show you briefly an example of a classroom lesson and some things that we did fun in that. It was like a PSSA prep lesson, and we had some staff members do some things to pump up our kids. And then we just talk about the results of that lesson pre and post. And then same thing with the small groups. This isn't my data year, but I focused on 2 small groups because they were similar. One was for males and one was for females, included some fun pictures of the staff members, and then the results reports. And then just little things at the end, I just included pictures. But I wanted to show you that because I wanted to point out that in a real ramp application, you do not want to include pictures. In just a general advisory council meeting, that's great. And the members love that. But when you submit a presentation for ramp, you want to make sure that there are no student names involved and no pictures. If you have just pictures that you pull, like general pictures, clip art, and things like that, that's fine. But you do not want to have any identifiable information about students in your presentation or in your application as a whole. That's a really big problem. So make sure you don't do that. But I at least wanted to show you a sample of what you can include in a presentation just in real life. If you do include that in your during your data year, because that is nice to include in a presentation, just make sure you take out those pictures when you submit your presentation, because you would turn it into a PDF. Just take out those slides with pictures when you include it, and you can note that in your application too, that there are slides, but they've been omitted for the purpose of the application. Laura, did you want to mention anything about that?
Well, I wanted to thank you for sharing that, because I just want to give people some encouragement that the fact that you're listening to this, I hope, is not just to have a successful application for ramp, but also just to set some foundation for yourselves and your school counseling program in your school. You're learning new professional practice with this. And I love that Leslie shared the presentation from her most recent advisory council meeting, because it's something that needs to keep going on. Once you earn ramp, which I'm sure many of you will, it's not something that ends there. It keeps going on. You keep building those relationships, not only with the students and your staff in your school, but with your community, who are your stakeholders that are part of your council. So I really love that you shared that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we want to help you. So we don't want this to be something that is scary, because like Laura said, the advisory council is one of my most favorite parts of a comprehensive school counseling program. They are your advocates. They are your cheerleaders. They know the most about what you do, and they're great. And anytime you have new initiatives, they usually want to be involved and on board. So hopefully this just inspires you and not scares you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we want to just talk about how to share data with stakeholders. You saw in Leslie's slides there, she had shared some bar graphs that look similar to the image that you see on your screen now. I do think it's okay to share some data that is not part of your RAMP application. For example, I think it's okay to share with stakeholders your year-end summary of services. Give them an idea of what your school counseling program does, because your program does more than what's on the ramp application. If you want helpful feedback, they need to know, how many groups do you run? how many MTSS or we're in Pennsylvania, or SAP team meetings do you have and do you participate in? Anything like that, just to give them an idea of what your school counseling program looks like. I always like to include the use of time analysis and reports that leads to pretty healthy, robust discussion about the school needs and priorities, what you're doing in terms of direct services and indirect services. This is a no-brainer, right? You're going to include your goal-related data based on the goals that you're setting for your RAMP application, and also go ahead and include some samples of your school culture. Like I said before, you want them to be able to understand what your school feels like, what the needs are like, what your mission is, and how all of the educators in your school come together to help the students. Specifically, you want to talk about how you as a school counselor leading your school counseling program supports the students. And then we just have clipped there. These are old, of course, because I earned RAMP back in 2020, but I don't know. Leslie, can you circle around the year of that top graph, that top line graph? Okay. I included the 2017-18 data. Remember that when you're setting your goals and kind of setting the stage, you're using data from the previous year to establish your goals. So that's okay to do. And that can also lead to some discussion among your members about how things change year to year in your school. So I don't know, is there anything to add to that, Leslie? Just to make sure you don't have to just provide them with the goal-related data, but you can do some other things to help them understand your school counseling program.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And like Laura said earlier, don't be afraid to be transparent about anything. I mean, because they appreciate that. They know you're a real person trying to help kids in their building. So don't be afraid to be transparent, especially if you don't meet your goals, that because it happens and that's okay. And that's where they come in to help you to reestablish some plans for next year, or to, to look at different things when you're setting up your goals. But data is so powerful because that's when things start to make sense. We know what we're talking about because we're living it. But when they start seeing bar graphs and pie graphs or whatever, it just really is clear. And administrators love that, by the way. So that you always see the administrators perking up when you talk about the data, because they really understand that. But people in general can see the difference that you're making. So it's really important.
Okay, so next, we've already touched on all these, but just some reminders about common scoring pitfalls. Not using the ASCA templates. That is one of the biggest pitfalls. So remember, you can always provide supplemental materials to your group. Just make sure that the ASCA style documents are included. Advisory council membership's not reflective or inclusive of the diverse voices and stakeholders within your school community. It's not clear in the narrative that the advisory council has been created for the sole purpose of supporting the school's comprehensive school counseling program. So I encourage you in your narrative to tell your story. This isn't going to matter so much to your ASCA RAMP reviewers, but if you tell the story of how your advisory council is specific to your school, make sure that you're developing a council that is specific to your school and not that K-12 guidance plan advisory council that we had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So tell your story about how you established your council, why and how you selected certain members, how it was going, how it started, all those kinds of things. So it's clear that this was also not created just for your RAMP application. And the other pitfall is not including the discussion from members during the meeting minutes, and making sure it's also an agenda item. Make sure that you allow for discussion opportunities during the meeting, and also make sure you document that in your minutes. I think those are the 4 big ones that people sometimes miss that causes them to lose points in this section.
And Laura and I really wanted to focus on these particular things because we're both new RAMP reviewers, and these are the things that came up from other RAMP reviewers. So
Yep.
these are good keys to keep in mind. And then just the last thing we wanted to just review again is just to remember just keys for that scoring rubric. Just remember that this section 5, has 6 possible points. Make sure that in each of these 6 sections that you check each of these descriptors to make sure that you met each of these components. So sometimes it's helpful to print this out and you just check it off. Like you're looking through your application. Okay, they're like proof that this is focused on the school counseling program. And your big proof on that particular one is they'll be able to tell that it's not your first meeting. Like your first meeting that you talk about, like your agenda and minutes, should look like it's been several meetings into your school life, that advisory council has met in the past. It's not just the introduction to the ASCO model and stuff, because that's a clear key that you just set up that advisory council for the ramp application. So, and they'll be able to tell. Make sure that all your advisory council members are listed and so forth. Make sure all of those descriptors are met, because if one is not met, you lose that point for that section. Remember, points are all or nothing. You either earn 1 point for 5A or 0, and it all depends on these descriptors. So really, you should be fine. Just make sure you look at that very closely. And for the reflection again, just make sure that you have a maximum of 250 words, and make sure that if for any section of a rubric, if it says give 2 or more examples, you need to at least give 2 or more examples. And and I hear this all the time from ramp reviewers, it's very nice to phrase your wording with one example of blah, 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 and another example of blah, blah, blah. Just make sure that you specifically lay out what those examples are. It's easy to read for the ramp reviewers, and they love that. So just easy. It's like we go back to our grammar school days when you learned grammar. Make sure you're using complete sentences. Don't list. That's another thing I saw, Laura. I don't know if you saw this, but make sure you are using complete sentences. Sometimes people will just list bullet points in that reflection. And I guess it doesn't say not to use bullet points, but it just looks better if you're using complete sentences. Did you run into that, Laura, as well?
No, we didn't see that. But yeah, you want to remember the audience that you're writing this for.
Mm-hmm. And really, ramp reviewers just want to understand what you're saying. So just be descriptive. And like Laura had mentioned, just remember like your audience. So if you're using acronyms, make sure you put in parentheses what that stands for, because a lot of times, as a reviewer, you're really trying to get into the application and understand the logic behind it. And you might get tripped up on an acronym and you're looking back to see what that meant. So just make sure you clarify that too. And have somebody that maybe isn't in your school system review your application or review certain sections of your application just in general, and see if they have any questions too as well.
Yeah. Yeah, an interesting thing that happened to me, I think that my advisory council really developed a good relationship. When for your application, you're going to need a school board member to sign it. And when I asked my school board member to come and sign the application, a really nice thing that happened to me is she read the whole thing. She caught some spelling errors. She made sure that it was understandable to somebody who wasn't in the middle of it. So those relationships with your advisory council are very important. They're going to come back and support you in all different kinds of things, including proofreading your ramp application.
Yes, that's true. And the other thing too, I didn't even think about this, Laura, until just now, but before you submit your ramp application, you have to present your entire application to your advisory council, and they have to sign off on it. So that's a really great way to have them look at things too. So I actually forgot about that. It's been a couple years, but yeah, they actually are really instrumental, and they are the last people to review your application before you hit that submit button. So this advisory council is such an important, it's just an important part of a comprehensive school counseling program, but also an important part of the rubric. That's why it actually has more points allotted to it than some of the other sections. So we just want to reiterate that we really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this particular video on the Advisory Council today. Please know that Laura and I and Dr. Fuller and many other people that you have heard from as the course of these videos have moved along through the Ramp Camp are more than willing to answer any and all questions that you may have. That's what we're here for. We have faith in you. We know you can do this. Laura and I have been through the process, and we know that there are many questions that come up. So we are willing to help you and guide you along the way, because we know you can do it.
Yeah, thank you. And like we said before, you'll have access to these slides and the hyperlinks. So definitely it's something you can refer back to. Also, if you're a member of ASCA, they also have a lot of information, because everybody wants you to be successful. So good luck and let us know if you need any support in anything.
Thank you and have a great day.